I'll get started. So, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. It's been a while since we've had one of our monthly events. I know we had one with Dan. Was it last month, Dan?
In August, yeah, early August.
Yeah, we really just focused on looking at the local authority accounts as they were at that point. Dan's going to give us a further update today. But after having had a fairly quiet summer, we'd hoped that there would have been some announcements back in July, just before the summer recess, but that didn't happen because of the pandemic. So I think everything's been pushed back now, and we're really looking at quite a busy autumn. I think we've had a busy week last week, some big announcements. We're now really in the run up to the spending review, so there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen quickly. Today what we're going to do is we're going to start off by looking at those social care reforms and what that means for the spending review, what that means for local government funding over the next 3 or so years. We'll break it up a bit by Dan will come in and do a session on what's happened in the last month on local authority accounts, latest data, see what's going on there as well. And then we'll come back in and we'll look again at local government funding reform and forecasting. And I think really the headline from that is that, you know, we're picking up that a lot of those big reforms that we'd expected for maybe 2023-24 could be pushed back a further 2 years. So pushed back to beyond the end of this next spending review period. So that's, I think, quite a big potential change. It's not confirmed yet. You know, we don't know whether that's going to happen, but certainly that's the kind of thing that we're picking up. Just to let you know, we are recording the session, and we'll put it on the website. I managed to get the slides on the website as well before, if you wanted to have a look at those. Otherwise, we'll crack on. We'll finish at 11 o'clock, and then there'll be time about half an hour after that if you want to stay on, ask some questions, make some points, conversation, debate, etc. So starting off with social care reform, this was an announcement really that was delayed from July. The link there is through to the proposal in detail. The proposals themselves, the reforms themselves, are not a surprise. They're based on broadly on the Dilnot report back in 2011, and the legislative basis for the reforms are from the Care Act that was passed back in 2014. So the structure of those reforms is not a surprise, and to be honest, the amounts that they put in there for the cap and the change in asset limits are not that much of a surprise either. So the headlines for those reforms are that there's an £86,000 cap on lifetime care costs, excluding the accommodation costs, and then an increase in the capital limits that you would apply for people to be eligible for support from the local authority. So those limits will go up from £23,250 up to £100,000, albeit with a taper from 20 through to 100,000. We don't know how the taper is going to work yet, but the net effect of those changes is that, of course, it means that people will pay less for their care over time, and the local authority will be liable for a higher share of those costs. I think the other reform that I think is almost, from I understand it, almost more important than the cap and the thresholds is this concept of market equalisation. So this is where there'll be harmonisation of rates between self-funders and the local authority. So self-funders will be able to secure their care packages through the authority, and as a result get access to lower rates. Self-funder rates can be as much as 50% higher than for the local authority. So that's going to have the effect of pushing up over time, pushing up the local authority rate, the amount that you're paying to your suppliers, to your providers. And I think as well, putting pressure on the providers themselves, at least in the short term, before those rates have harmonised themselves. So that's a really big cost and a really big pressure. But the net effect of all these changes is that self-funders will pay less for their care over their lifetime. So a maximum cap on what they pay, they're able to keep more assets, and they're able to get a lower price for their care. So less for self-funders to pay, but that leaves more cost for the local authorities to fund. The additional cost of all these reforms is going to be met from this new health and social care levy, effectively an increase in national insurance contributions by 1.25 percentage points, and the same increase in dividend tax as well. In theory, all these new revenues are ring-fenced for health and social care, although in practice, you know, there's such a lot of money swirling around in the Treasury, it's not a hard trick to pull off. The health and social care levy raises about £11.4 billion net, so that's net of all the other consequentials like public sector effects and the impact on benefits, etc. So about 11.4 billion net annually from the 1st of April 2022. Although the levy itself will only come into being in April 23, so the national insurance contributions will happen from April 22, but it'll only be called a levy from April 23 as more of an administrative issue rather than a practical one. So these increases will raise 36 billion over 3 years. That includes 5.4 billion for the social care reforms, 25 billion for the NHS recovery, and 5.7 billion for the Barnett consequentials, i.e. for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. In theory, the levy will then be used to fund social care from 25-26, although I don't know anyone who actually thinks that's going to happen, and ministers themselves won't actually give you a cast iron commitment about how they'll do it or when it'll be done or if it will be done at all. So I don't think any local authority treasurer is going to be budgeting on the basis that you'll be getting your hands on that £12 billion a year to fund social care. This is an important question, and it's one that we've had quite a lot of over the last week, which is what will happen to, obviously you as employers will be liable for the employee and to the employer element of the national insurance contribution increase. And what the government has done is they've set aside money within the calculations to fund the cost of increasing those national insurance contributions for public bodies. So there's about £1.7 billion per year over the 3 years, and those estimates are going to be finalised in autumn 2021, so later this year. I don't know how they're actually going to give you the funding. I've heard one indication from a civil servant, I think in a call with counties on Friday, that last Friday rather, that local authorities will be funded on the basis of their costs. I guess that you'll make a return to government saying how much the additional national insurance contributions have actually cost you. That sounds quite administratively burdensome, but it also does raise the question about whether you would only get funding for direct employees or whether you would also get funding for employees within wholly owned companies or in third parties. My guess is if they proceed on that basis that you'll only get funding for direct employees, but we'll wait and see. I mean, the alternative would be just to distribute the funding that's available based on a formula. So you get the funding for the additional national insurance contributions, regardless of whether that's in-house provision or through a third party. There's clearly more to come on that, though. So now looking at the funding that the sector will get for social care reform, as we said, it's 5.4 billion over 3 years, of which 500 million is for workforce reform. But given that the reforms only are only implemented in October 2023, the annual cost or the annual funding that you're going to get for those reforms is about 3 billion to 3.2 billion per year on an annual basis. And I think the big question is going to be, is that enough? How's the department or the Department for Health estimated what the costs are? Are they reasonable? Are they realistic? The LGA estimates that the cost of harmonisation alone, so that's the market equalisation element of the reforms, will cost about £5 billion a year. CCN have done a similar sort of exercise. They think it will cost county authorities about 670 million. So around half of the funding might be taken up just with the cost of harmonisation. before the reforms were published, the Health Foundation estimated that the cost of a £50,000 cap would be itself £3.1 billion a year. Clearly, an £86,000 cap would be lower and would cost less, but it doesn't feel like it would be that much less. So my guess is that probably the £3.2 billion a year funding that's going to be available is probably a bit on the low side, as you'd expect. So I think as a sector, there'll need to be quite a bit of pushback to government to say, look, these reforms are going to cost more than you think. But I think that's something that's going to play out in the next 12 months or so. Then, of course, the next problem we'd have is how do you actually distribute that funding between authorities? If there's a fixed, or a fixed-ish pot of funding, how do you get that out to authorities? And I guess part of it's going to be how's the government estimating what the cost is going to be of those reforms. We understand that they may only have uprated the assumptions that they made back in 2015. Things have changed a lot since then. So, how up to date is that? Funding could then be distributed to local authorities based on either, you reporting what your actual costs are, or more likely some kind of formula that draws on data from demography, average asset values for clients, average weekly care payments. So my guess is it'll be something around the latter, but I think that'll take time to develop because you don't know yet what your costs are going to be. So as I say here, that I think the government's going to need a lot more information from you as local authorities about, what the impact is of these reforms. There's going to be a complex interaction between the cap, the higher thresholds, and the harmonised rates to arrive at what the actual cost annually is to use an authority. The proposal said that specific funding allocations for each local authority would be you'd be given them by MHCLG in the usual way through the settlement. So whether that's the settlement in December or probably possibly more likely the year after, we don't know. It all seems a little bit not disorganised, but they've not got quite on top of it yet, I don't think. As I said, the picture will take time to emerge. How many self-funders will actually come forward? I think the department's probably saying, well, we don't think there'll be that many, but I think local authorities will say, well, actually, we think there'll be more than you'd imagine. And how will harmonisation be managed with providers? How much that pain do providers take up? How much can they take up? And how much falls on you as an authority? So I think the funding formula needs to be flexible and to develop over time. That probably suggests it'll be a specific grant outside the SFA, for now at least. And to some degree, I think the government recognises that. Within the proposal, it says that it will consult on its proposals for funding distribution and keep this distribution under review. So a recognition there that things won't settle down for a while and they'll need to reflect on that. But how much that actually delivers to you what you need in terms of funding is another matter. So that's one to really keep an eye on. So the latest social care funding gap, obviously it's pretty significant, but the key message from what came out last week is that there's no additional funding for either existing or future funding pressures from the levy itself. The only money that's going into social care will effectively pass straight on to fund the reform package. The statement itself was pretty non-committal, and I think authorities have been pretty disappointed with what it said. It says that increases in demand and unit costs will have to be funded from increases in council tax, adult social care precept, and long-term efficiencies. So effectively, it's saying, we're putting it back over to you. You're going to fund it from yourself from council tax increases, which, obviously is unrealistic. It'll put far too much pressure on you individually as authorities, and it just doesn't fit in with what's happened in the past. For the last 5, 6, 7 years, they've given you additional funding every year for social care, and I can't see that stopping. So really, I think the settlement that we're going to get is going to be part of the spending review. And I think part of the reason why they haven't said very much about the funding that's likely to be available to you, it is really because they're waiting for the spending review on the 27th of October, towards the end of next month. And I think it's at that point that you will find out about what additional funding is likely to be available for social care over the next 3 years. So I think it's realistic to say that we can expect more funding in the spending review for social care. And I think going further than that, I would say that we'd expect real terms growth in spending on social care over the spending review period. The short term 22-23, again, that should be part of the spending review package. So again, I would expect to see real terms growth in grants for social care, even in the short term as well. And I think really what we saw in the proposal last week was as much a holding statement as anything else. Looking at the NHS funding settlement itself, I think it's important for us for a number of reasons. One is that it shows you that the NHS won't have enough money. It never has enough money, and it's not likely to give up its grip on the revenues from the health and social care levy in 2020, 25-26 when the government said that it will. But also I think it just shows you that the amount of money that's going into health, into the NHS, and the degree to which that's going to rev up the activity levels within the NHS, which again will put pressure back on you as local authorities. So the NHS is going to receive 80% of the levy, so that's £25 billion over 3 years, an estimated £10 billion of which will be for the elective care backlog, so specifically for just addressing the waiting list, which has started to really get out of hand. The IFS reporting that represents 3.9% real terms growth between 18-19 and 24-25. So, you know, reasonably strong growth in the health service funding over that period. But one worrying thing, I think, is what the Health Foundation is saying, which is that to meet the 18-week standard on the waiting list by 24-25 would have required close to £17 billion over this Parliament. So even with this funding, the waiting list will almost certainly be longer at the end of the Parliament than it is now. So I think what we're going to see is that the NHS will get a lot of funding over the next 3 years, but it won't be sufficient to bring that waiting list down to within the 18-week standard. So what's going to happen is towards the end of that 3-year period, the NHS is going to be coming back and asking for even more money, rather than saying, we've had enough. You know, we've had our 3 years with the levy, let's hand it over to social care. I think the opposite's likely to be the case. It's likely going to be asking for even more money. And I think one statistic that I think is quite frightening really is that just the share of public spending that the NHS is consuming and the degree to which that is increasing. So it was 27% back in 1999-2000, the early years of the Blair government. It increased to 32% by 2009-10, 42% by 1920, and it's a planned 44% by 24-25. And to be honest, there's no real sign that share will be diminishing. So there's pressure on the public sector, on public spending generally, but that doesn't really seem to apply to the NHS. So the NHS, you know, increasingly is dominating what's happening within the public sector and within public spending nationally, which I think for us is a worry. Just looking at the NHS funding settlement, you can see here the degree to which that has increased over the period, and you can see there the green shows you the pre-COVID settlement, the yellow and the purple start to show you the additional amounts of funding that have been given to the NHS. So on the one hand, you can see that the additional amounts are really quite significant. So you can see there that in 2021, 21, 22, they're significant. You can see as well, though, that the two things towards the back end of that in 23, 24 and 24, 25. The first is the purple block, the funding that was announced last week. Actually, that's less in 23, 24 than it was in 22, 23. You know, as the cost of social care starts to build up, there's less available for the NHS, so the growth rate starts to diminish. But you can also see in 24, 25 that the trend rate that was put in place pre-COVID is pretty much honoured by 24, 25. So a lot of the additional money has been to deal with the shorter term pressures within the NHS, rather than to put it on a particularly much higher or much faster growth rate than was anticipated before the pandemic. So for us outside the NHS, that shows you that the NHS needs to consume increasing amounts of funding. But the worrying thing is that the trajectory it's put back on by 24-25 is not that dissimilar from what was seen or what was anticipated before the pandemic. So I think that's really building up into a continuing problem for the NHS and for the public sector as a whole. Another point that I think has been developed really well by the Institute for Fiscal Studies is just the degree to which the NHS outturn is always greater than its the planned amount of spending. I think pretty much every year, or nearly every year, the NHS has exceeded the amount a budget that's been available for it. So even with the increase, the NHS, the IFS is saying the NHS will probably outstrip the amount of funding that's made available for it. It's done so almost every other year. And you can see from that chart there, the outturn's almost always greater than the amount of funding that's made available for it. So the IFS conclusion is that the funding settlement that was put forward last week is more likely a lower bound, not a firm set of limits. Looking forward to the spending review to be announced at the end of next month. The fiscal envelope was announced by the Chancellor in a letter to permanent secretaries last week. It'll be a 3-year spending review, 22-23, 23-24, 24-25. So a return to multi-year full funding allocations. The envelope itself was based on the March 2021 budget assumptions. So they were the ones that, in terms of the performance of the economy and the public finances, were the ones that were set out by the Office for Budget Responsibility. But they're going to be updated on the 27th of October for the spending review. So I think people are quite pessimistic about what that fiscal envelope indicated for the funding that's available. But I think most forecasters are saying, well, actually, they think there'll be more available for government to spend than is anticipated in the in that letter. So first of all, government borrowing has been lower since March, £26 billion less than forecast by the LBR. So already expenditure's lower and revenues are improved already to the tune of £26 billion since March 2021. There are additional revenues from the health and social care levy and from the dividend tax, £36 billion over that 3-year period. But as we know, all of that's allocated. But also the government announced last week that they were going to suspend the triple lock on pensions. It's now going to be a double lock, and that saves about £5 billion. But that hasn't been allocated yet, so that will be additional funding to spend. The increase in real terms growth is starting to increase as well, or rather it's pushed, those assumptions start to push through to higher real terms growth. So increasing from 2.1% to 3.2% real terms over the period. The IFS make the point that although things are looking better, the projections are still about £2 to £3 billion lower for non-protected services than they were in the pre-pandemic plans, and there's still £17 billion worth of unallocated cuts within those plans, which the Chancellor will need to deal with. So things are definitely improving, and the fiscal envelope is likely to be much better than it was in the Chancellor's letter. I think one point that we should expect to see in the spending review that wasn't brought out at all last week is this really important assumption about the long-term scarring effect of the pandemic on the economy. In the OBR's forecast back in March, they assumed the long-term scarring effect will be about 3%. But since then, the Bank of England has come forward with more optimistic assumptions, and they think the scarring effect is possibly only going to be 1% of GDP. So that could release about 19 to £25 billion worth of funding a year in addition. So that's certainly a really good thing for us in local government. The chart on the right, I think, illustrates. This is the chart from April, so from March earlier this year, and it shows you just how important it is for this Chancellor to have a balanced budget by the end of the Parliament. So even though things were looking more gloomy back in March, the projections that that were produced in the budget showed really clearly that the government wanted to have a balanced budget by the end of the Parliament, and was prepared to put in there £17 billion worth of unallocated savings. But I think with what's happening here with the improved forecasts, that the Chancellor will not need to find those savings, and that's a good thing, I think, for us in local government. So, but at the same time, just recognising that should suggest no cuts rather than any big increases in funding. So I think the Resolution Foundation is saying that for non-protected services outside the NHS, there's going to be no significant increase in the spending power of unprotected departments over the course of the spending review. So that should at least mean that our funding tracks inflation, which is much better than we've had for much of the past decade, but no big real terms growth. And of course, even if non-protected services are growing more than inflation, there's strong competition from elsewhere in the public sector to get their hands on that funding. So you might argue that schools, prisons and defence have got a better claim on that growth than non-protected services within local government. There's some big things as well that the spending review is going to have to capture. COVID recovery and the catch-up plans. You know, the NHS has had its catch-up plan. There's been some money put aside for schools, but only 5 billion out of the 15 billion that they wanted. Will we get any money for catch-up from COVID? Not sure. Levelling up, we can see from the reshuffle yesterday that that's a much more important policy objective. I think that will possibly influence how the direct funding to local government is distributed, but clearly a lot of new funding pots that will be distributed, 4.8 billion of levelling up fund. And I think connected to that devolution, some really big changes I think are likely to go on with the county devolution deals and spreading devolution out beyond their current boundaries. We might see something in the spending review about business rate reform, revaluation frequency, certainly a possible replacement even to business rates, but I think certainly some kind of online sales tax. So big business rates changes down the line possibly. House building continues to be a big policy objective, and I think we may see something in the spending review about the replacement for new homes bonus as well, so let's keep our eyes on that. The one thing I wanted to note to you as well was something that actually Robert Jenrick, the previous Secretary of State, said to the LGA over the summer that as part of levelling up, they've been looking at local authorities to have 10 to 20 year forecasts and spending plans. I think there were lots of eyebrows raised within the sector about that, but that's certainly something that I think that we could work on, and something that from our point of view in Pixel we'll actually try and spend some time on and work with you on to see whether, or to see how far that is possible. For COVID itself, funding's winding down now. There's one final tranche of funding in the current year, the 1.55 billion, one final quarter of sales fees and charges compensation, but pretty much that's it. You're waiting for your payments for the tax income guarantee from last year, but it's not being extended into the current year. I think there's clearly some evidence that the government overfunded your COVID pressures last year. Although not all will agree. I know some of you spent all the funding that you got, but there's not likely to be any further funding in the current financial year. But what we saw in the monthly spending from your monthly monitoring reports is that although monthly spending dropped in April 2021, so instead of it being around 600 million as it had been in the last financial year, it was down to 377 million in April. You're still forecasting to spend 2.3 billion over the first half of this year. So that's a good deal more than you like to get in any funding. So I think as a sector, we're going to be looking at the government to give us, further post-pandemic recovery funding and to deal with the effects of the pandemic, which have not been equally felt across the sector. Right, so that's the first section, looking at the social care reform and the spending review. Before we look at local government funding reform in more detail, I'll hand over to Dan.
Thanks, Adrian. Just doing a 5-minute cameo to break Adrian up and updating you on the latest work that I've done on the accounts. Those of you that subscribe, the main models, reserves, and the capital health are almost complete. We'll be sending out next week for you to have a more detailed look at your position. So last time we spoke in early August, we'd been through and looked at what we could find, and those were the numbers. 77% of authorities had released their accounts, and I was quite surprised. I was expecting quite a few just to be slightly delayed, the odd week or two. But we still have 58 that aren't published as of a couple of days ago when I last looked, and actually looked last night for the upper tiers. So there's still a significant amount there. Still 6 London boroughs yet to publish, 3 Mets, 6 unitaries, all the counties bar Northamptonshire, which is disappearing, have published now, and a fair raft of districts that remain unpublished. I got asked the other day by an authority that's taking, where the auditors are taking their final accounts, if there were many that had done. I haven't looked in detail at this, but across when I've been looking at things, I haven't found one yet where the auditors look ready to do the all the gubbins so that the final statements can be published. So I suspect 70, 80, 90% might miss that deadline based on what I can see. You can still see a lot of 1920 draft accounts because the 1920 audits haven't been finished on top of the 2021 accounts. So a really incomplete picture, but enough to go on to talk through some key messages. So if we move on one, Adrian. First with reserves, what I've shown here, it's just an update from picture which I showed you at the last time. That is the level of reserves. Top graph is the level of reserves by type of authority as a proportion of net revenue expenditure. Districts have always had more. Inner London has always had the most of the upper tiers. But also below there is the reserves increase, but the bit in white in both analyses is effectively the reserves that include collection fund connotations, mainly the RHL grants that are sitting in earmarked reserves, but will disappear to fund the collection funded deficits over the next year. So I've done a little bit of work with the LGA, and I've said I'll share this with the LGA because they're really nervous that Treasury is going to do a raid based upon reserves levels, which are just artificially high at the moment. We've talked about this before, but I think it's really important that what you see there is pretty much all of the increases in reserves are artificial. They're to do with collection fund differences, mainly the RHL grants that are sat in reserves and will fund next year's deficit. So if we move on very quickly through these next couple of slides, Adrian, can you move it forward? So that's districts, and those of you in membership will get yourself picked out there. There's the districts reserves, skewed by 1 or 2 that have massive levels of reserves associated with investment properties. But it shows the increase after the collection fund adjustment account adjustment that I do, which effectively tries to remove the impact of the COVID grants and other collection funds. What you see there is most authorities, even districts, reserves went up, but still a handful where they've come down. But actually there's some artificial, beyond the grants that we know about, there are other grants that are COVID related that I suspect will spill out reserves as they're used next year. And I think there's much more, has been a much higher propensity to underspend in the COVID year, which is kind of a one-off thing, but potentially because things just didn't get done. So it's a really difficult picture. And in the middle of it, there's a spending review where the government, it might be looking at reserves on a macro level and get the wrong idea. So I think as a sector, we've really got to fight back against that. If we move on, one should show you the upper tier version of that. So again, color coded according to the type of authority. But what you have here, the one on the far left, I've talked to you before, is I think the accounts are wrong. there is no RHL grant in their earmarked reserve, so I think they put it in creditors or something. So ignore that. But what you see here is very few of the upper tier authorities, although one or two, have had a real terms reduction in reserves. So there's a lot more COVID impact sitting in increase in reserves. But as we all know, upper tiers, quite a few of those upper tiers are really close to the edge in terms of their financial sustainability, as shown by very low levels of reserves as a proportion of net revenue expenditure. So whilst it might have done well on the face of it, I suspect another year we'll see those reserves start to deplete again as the COVID reserves and the underspends disappear, which is why it's really important the spending review is a positive one. If we move on, I'll very quickly go through capital health. So we've talked through this before other sessions. One thing that I'm really interested in is capital health. It's no surprise that there is a link between poor capital health at places like Croydon and Northamptonshire and one or two others that have got financial support, but we don't tend to look at that. So what I've looked at here is a look at the debt gearing over the years, including this latest year, of different types of authorities, and it's astonishing really that Mets have 3 or 4 times the debt gearing as does in London. So they have 3 or 4 times more debt to service, and it'll be important that I would say that any funding review takes that into account. But what it shows as well is in unitaries and districts where there's a lot more commercial investment, the debt gearing is going up. Now, whether that's a thing we should be worried about or not, possibly on a macro level less so, but on an individual level, there are a few authorities that are really struggling, I think, in terms of capital health, all of which I think which is missed by the potential framework, which is currently focused just on commercial properties. If you move on to what I think is more worrying, is your capital adjustment account. So the capital adjustment account, to me, it gets credited with all the funding of assets, including MRP, and it gets debited with the depletion of assets, which might be depreciation, impairment, downward revaluation, etc. So a reducing capital adjustment account effectively says that we are depleting our assets at a rate that is quicker than we are funding them. So effectively, you're moving towards a position of more negative equity, or you're losing equity. And I think what you're seeing there is probably a result of the stress on the sector generally, in that we might not be looking after assets so well, so they're more likely to deplete. We might be giving ourselves MRP holidays, or being a little bit, in order to take the pressure off revenue, giving ourselves, making our MRP, sweating our assets, making the loans last longer, not paying them off notionally as quickly. But it all starts to manifest into a picture that says slowly but surely local government is becoming more in debt and has less equity in its assets. So again, probably not a big cause concern at the moment, but you can see if we move on to the next slide, the analysis that we do for some authorities, I would say is an immediate concern, because they are very, very highly geared, and at a point where there's no certainty of funding, and your capital financing costs, because you have such a high level of debt, don't go away, and they maybe increase at a time when your funding decreases, then effectively capital financing is crowding out service provision, because it has that first call on reducing resources. So again, I think it's an interesting one that's generally missed. But as I said at the start, it's no coincidence that Croydon has the highest gearing of any outer London borough. Northamptonshire did for any county. So I think it's something that we ignore at our peril. So the models that underpin this from the accounts are almost complete so there'll be more of this coming forward. But that's just an update for now. I'm very happy at the end to answer any questions that you might put in the chat, but I will pass you back to Adrian. Thanks, Adrian.
Great, thanks, Dan. I think that's just really, really really important, because and it's really good news that the LGA are going to try and use some of that down, I guess, in their submission to the spending review for the 30th of September. You know, it shows some really important facts about what's going on with local government and local government health.
Yeah.
Looking now in a bit more detail at what we think might happen for local government funding within all that context. In terms of, this really sort of sets out what we've got in our modelling at the moment, which is broadly that we're expecting a rollover settlement, a one-year settlement again in 22-23, and we've modelled the major reforms, fair funding review, baseline reset, etc., will happen in the following year, 23-24. You know, and I think a lot of those assumptions that you'll see there, you're familiar with. We just carried them forward: 2% for council tax, for Band D for council tax, £5 minimum for districts. You know, expecting adult social care precepts again at around 2 to 3%, especially given what was said in the social care reform proposals last week. But of course, that's in addition to the flexed 21-22 precepts, which a lot of you, well, some of you, certainly counties in particular, didn't take in full in 21-22, and it'll be interesting to see the degree to which they do get pushed forward and added to further increases in 22-23. So as I said, it suggests some really high Band D increases, and I do wonder whether there is an upper limit in political terms from either central government or local government about, you know, what is the highest level of Band D increase, or the upper limit to the percentage increase every year. As I said earlier, really, we are expecting further growth for social care grants. 500 million is our estimate. But for those of you who've got high tax bases, yeah, I think equalisation is a big deal. You know, if you're going to be allowed to do 2 to 3% precepts, that they're certain to equalise those precept increases out in the grant allocation. So just to be aware of that. The new homes bonus, we're still assuming just the one final payment in 22-23, and that we should have some kind of new scheme, whatever that is, out of the spending review. In our modelling, we're still assuming that as a lower tier services grant in 22-23, simply because we're just assuming a full rollover into that financial year. In SFA terms, I think we've been quite pessimistic, assuming 0% for non-protected services, 2% for social care. I think the numbers we looked at earlier today, pardon me, suggest something a bit better than that, but that's our kind of more cautious set of forecasts. And of course, you might have seen the news yesterday that the CPI for September was 3.2%, so it's jumped up quite a bit. And I think ministers, well, certain forecasters are thinking it might be a bit higher again. But for us, the key thing about the September CPI is that will set the multiplier. So in theory, that'll be 3.2%. I think we need to watch out to see that. I'm fairly sure that'll be capped at somewhere around 2%. And if that is the case, I think I'd be fairly sure that the government will fully fund the effect of them capping the multiplier at something below the actual rate of inflation. So watch out for that. To pick out a few issues within the forecast, the first one is just looking at pardon me, funding for adult social care. And I tried to do a bit of an analysis just to look at not just the funding that you've got through the grants, but also an estimation of the amount of funding that's within your SFA as well, because clearly that's the bigger amount of funding. So, albeit based on some assumptions, we've looked at what those numbers are. And as you can see there, the blue shows you the funding within SFA. You can see that actually dropped over the earlier years up to 1920, but then started to build again as SFA was increased with inflation. But you can see the degree to which the social care grants have really added to the amount of funding that you've got for social care and made that really quite significant. But a few things that are worth noting now. The first is that in most years, the additional increase in funding for social care is below inflation, or it's below 2% certainly. The only year that wasn't the case was in 2021, where you had that big £1 billion increase in grants. So that would have been equivalent to about 6.3% of expenditure. So that's the only year in the recent past where funding for social care has gone up by more than inflation. In 22-23, if there is a 2% increase in SFA and there's a 2% and there's a £500 million increase in social care grant, then that would be equivalent to about a 3.2% growth in funding compared to expenditure. So that would be, well, actually, be bang on inflation. So, but if we assume inflation in long term is more like 2%, yeah, it's a small 1.2% real terms growth rate in funding. So it's probably not too far off the mark. But I think what it does show is that the degree to which the government's lent on your council tax revenues, the cumulative increase in spending over the period has been 3.3 billion. The increase in direct funding only 1.8 billion for the same years. So the gap has been funded by additional council tax. So you can see there that the average blend, or the blend normally between what the government gives you, which tends to be below inflation, and then the amount that you're asked to find from your social care precept or from other revenues. New homes bonus replacement, for some of you, this is a really important development that we're looking out for. I really would expect something to come out of the spending review in some way. The consultation paper left all the options open. You will recall that consultation paper earlier in the year. It didn't really tell us what the shape of a new scheme might be. In theory, there's £900 million within the settlement for new homes bonus, or low in practice. A lot of it's been top sliced for other grants. And I think there still does remain the outside possibility, I think, that there's one further additional 1 year payment in 22-23 in the same way that we've had in this year and the previous year. But I think that the more interesting development and potentially really important development is what we're picking up on the latest thinking on local government funding reforms, and that these might be changing quite fundamentally. I think we know that it's too late to implement anything in 22-23. It's not been confirmed yet by government, but everyone knows that it's too late to do anything of any substance for next year. What we're picking up, and thanks to those of you who've fed some of this back to me, it's been really useful. I think in some of the meetings that civil servants have had with local authority groups, the feedback they're kind of passing back to us is they're saying that the sector doesn't want more disruption over the next 3 years. You're already dealing with social care reform, COVID recovery, levelling up, devolution. What you're telling MHCLG is there's already enough on your plate. You don't want the further disruption of a fair funding review and business rates changes, all that kind of thing. And I think this probably also feeds into what ministers, new and old, want to do, which is to announce firm funding allocations for the next spending review period. I think they really got a lot of benefit in the last spending review period about being able to say we've given you certainty and predictability, and my guess is they'll want to do that again. And having a whole load of fair funding review changed in the middle of that spending review period doesn't help them achieve that. So if that is the case, and that is where the department's moving to, where the government's moving to, that suggests that the bulk of the funding reforms will be delayed until 2025-26. So that's into a new spending review period, pardon me, and into the new parliament as well. Having said that, I can't see them making no changes at all over the next 3 years, but that then leaves the question of, well, which changes will they make? And I think putting that together, that's going to make forecasting funding much more difficult over the next 6 months. So a lot of it's going to be quite intelligence-led, certainly in the run-up to the spending review and the settlement in December. So what are the things that we think might change in the next spending review period if the fair funding review and some other reforms are delayed for 3 years? Well, I think there's a possibility they may start using the new adult social care formula. There's a new formula that's been developed. It was done back in 2015-16. It's a good formula. It was developed to go alongside the Care Act reform. So in some respects, it fits in with the new funding environment in a better way. Will they look at updating population projections? If they don't, then we'll still be using 2012 population projections in 2025-26. So they'll be well out of date, and I think that's starting to affect the credibility of the funding review, the funding formula rather. for lots of you districts in particular, a delay in the baseline reset, I think will be hugely welcome, but I'm not sure whether that would happen. The main reason being that I think the Treasury's got its eye on the 1.5 billion plus of retained rates that you've got, and looking at some method of getting their hands on that. I think a replacement for Newham's bonus goes without saying, and the possibility of whether they'll refresh some other data within the SFA as well. I think the issue of doing any of that stuff, though, is even then they're on a really tight timescale to get any of that done for 22, 23. You know, and if they delay a year, then that's kind of half. It's partly undermined the reason for delaying anyway, and that we'll get more upheaval in 23, 24, partway through the spending review. So not an easy set of problems for the department to handle. The things that I think are much more likely to be delayed are things like council tax equalisation and the flatter distribution that was being proposed as part of the foundation formula. They're things that are really disruptive. They really move a lot of money around the country. So if officials are looking to avoid things that are very disruptive, then they're the things that you don't do. As I said about timing, 22, 23 difficult to achieve. So 23, 24 looks more likely, but that just again brings in further change midway through the spending review period. Looking in a bit more detail at a couple of those proposals. The first is looking at adult social care and the formula that's been developed. I mean, we've had that new formula in our fair funding model for a year or so now, and you can look at how that's calculated in that formula, in that spreadsheet rather. We've also done some analysis work which we shared with you again about 18 months ago, maybe even 2 years ago, about how that new formula would work and the effect that it would have on you individually as an authority. And just as illustration, on the right hand side, this is the kind of analysis that you could look at. It shows you the indicators that are being proposed, things like attendance allowance, limiting conditions, living arrangements, and they're the new indicators that are being proposed. But what's also interesting is you'll see in the middle-ish of the chart, or slightly to the right of it, there are two blocks there for showing you the proportion of homeowners that are in the lower council tax bands and the proportion that are in the higher bands. And effectively, what those indicators do is that they provide some weighting, some reflection of, or a proxy rather, of the wealth of your older people and the degree to which they will have assets that they can use to self-fund. So in that sense, you can see that it would work well with the Care Act and the latest reforms that were announced last week. So in that respect, it would be a good fit with what they're proposing to do. But the problem is that it does move money around quite a bit within social care. Some really big changes, some really big swings. And if you look at the chart, you can see some of the biggest gainers are places like Wokingham, Richmond upon Thames, Surrey, for instance. And some of the biggest losers are places like Knowsley, like Manchester, like Hackney, South Tyneside. So it would really move things around quite significantly. And I think one of the filters you should always look at these kind of changes is, how does that fit in with the levelling up agenda? How good does that look if they're moving money out of places like, like South Tyneside and shifting it into places like Wokingham and Surrey? My guess is it doesn't look very good. And when these numbers were shared by the LGA a couple of years ago, I think the caveat they put around it was, yes, this might move money around quite a lot, but it will be done in the context of lots of other changes. If the major reform packages are being delayed for 3 years, that's not going to be the case. This sort of thing would be happening in isolation. So even if they're just containing the changes in funding to just changing some of the social care formula, that's still a big deal, I think. But maybe they'll just apply it to the new additional social care funding packages. I guess the other filter to now bear in mind is that the new Secretary of State represents a constituency in Surrey, so maybe he might not be quite so concerned about moving money into that part of the world. Then the baseline reset, as I mentioned earlier, our modelling still assumes a full baseline reset in 2023-24. That would raise, or that would generate for the Treasury about 1.5 billion pounds worth of resources that it could redirect back into other things like social care, or potentially into damping changes that have been the result of formula changes. So my guess is the Treasury's still got a real eye on this and will want to get hold of it. The problem is, though, I think for the department, they haven't got proposals in place for a new rate, for a new baseline, and it's difficult to create a new baseline, a permanent one, until the shakeout sort of settles down after the pandemic. So difficult to do a baseline reset that's permanent. Of course, though, there are interim solutions. We've modelled a floating top-up and tariff, which would effectively capture everyone's retained growth every year and use that for redistribution. So does that happen in 22-23? I think not. Is it delayed till 23-24? Possibly, or more likely. But again, that does bring in more disruption at some point in the future. But I know for many of you, this is the most important factor in planning your budgets over the medium term. So what does that mean for forecasting? Forecasting scenario number one is the one that we've already set the model up to show you, which is a rollover settlement in 22-23, where most things are just rolled forward for 1 year, and then with major funding reforms implemented in 23-24. So as I said, our models are set up on that basis. The second scenario might be a rollover settlement in 22-23 with no major reforms in either 23-24 or 24-25. In other words, it's a rollover settlement for 3 years, with very little change within that, or a rollover settlement in 22-23 with some reforms in 23-24, things like the baseline reset, some changes in funding formula. At this point, I think these are things that we're just sketching out. We don't know how the department's going to handle things like levelling up, or the spending review, or how it wants to sort of manage the programme over the next 3 years. So we're reluctant to do anything much more until we get a bit more information from the department, and then that's not really going to be until after the spending review, or even the provisional settlement in December. So that's the presentation as we have it. I think what we're seeing is there's quite a lot of uncertainty around what's happening with the spending review, and with funding for social care reform. But the big thing I think is changing is just the degree to which ministers are recasting what they think is going to happen over the next 3 years. And I do think that's going to be difficult to handle in the next 6 months. You're having to put together your medium-term financial plans, even your short-term budget for 22-23, and with that level of uncertainty, I think that's a really, really tough task. So we'll finish there. I think we're about a minute earlier than planned, but I guess Dan, we can just go into the debate section.
A couple of questions and questions that I've had previously. A couple of people asking, what is the likelihood of you say a rollover settlement? What's the likelihood of getting 3 to 4 year settlements, whatever scenario they use, or will it just be a series of 1 year settlements? And then I've had questions separately. Someone who couldn't make it today, and somebody's intimated it, about the national insurance levy and whether there will be any compensation with all the additional national insurance costs, whether local authorities will get any recognition of that.
Yeah, I think that they're very keen to make sure there is funding available for the national insurance contribution increases. They've definitely put money aside for that, Dan, the 1.7 billion. How they get that out to you, I don't know. How they get that out to authorities, I don't know how they're going to do that. I've heard people say that civil servants have said they'll do it on the basis of you telling them what it's going to cost you, but I'm not sure about that. That seems quite administratively burdensome. I'm not sure that's quite going to work. On the other side of things, on the 3 year settlement, I think it's tricky for them to square that circle. Really, I think they'll want to give authorities that 3-year certainty. You know, that, I mean, I think it works really well in the last spending review period where you had 4 years of firm allocations. I think the problem is going to be that, you know, there are things they're going to need to put through in the next 3 years, but it's going to be difficult to make that happen before before the provisional settlement in December. You know, they're really up against it to actually get things happening for 22-23. I don't know what you think. I think that's a really tough. It's such a short timescale now.
Yeah, great. Jeff's got his hand up. Do you want to unmute Jeff and go for it?
Yeah, Jeff.
One that Adrian's picking up then on insurance. Our understanding is that we pay our national insurance across to the HMRC every month.
Yeah.
And the government are going to use that data to repay the national insurance.
I see what you mean. Have you heard that, Jeff, or is that something you think would be a good idea?
Adrian, that's what I picked up from the call with MHCLG and CCN session. I picked up from that discussion.
Right. So in that sense, if that is the case, then that would just be your direct employees. It wouldn't be any employees in a wholly owned company or a third party.
Yeah, don't see any circumstance where we get that money back at all. And obviously, if we do get the money back, we'll then have the fun of splitting it between the council and all of our schools. But it'll be a fun game, kind of doing all of the coding. But I guess as far as we're concerned, there's no intervention required. It will just be a cash flow issue for us.
Right. That's interesting to know that. Yeah. But it sounds like that's certainly a commitment from the government to make sure they've funded it, isn't it? Yeah. Tony, you made a comment there that there's, with very little money available for social care, it's difficult to see how they could start moving money around, and I guess including within social care itself.
Yes, I mean, all the things that have come up, and you've mentioned some. We've just had another one. So things like the problem of how would you implement a fair funding review, or how would the local authority costs of national insurance be funded, bump up against the same problem from the government, the new Secretary of State's point of view, which is that, you know, council spending is 20 to 25% lower than it was in 2010, and unless there is extra money in the system, bracket from where, and I totally agree with your analysis about the way the extra national insurance revenue will be used. Though the idea of anybody ever taking it away from the NHS is frankly for the birds. So, so some extra money will have to be found in the future. But against that backdrop, you know, the only way then, if there's no extra money in the system for local government, other than the effectively ring-fenced money for adult social care, then as ever, all other services, including children's social care, will have to spend less, because a zero increase within which adult social care goes up means everything else has to go down. And that means that any wrinkles because of a fair funding, any changes because of a fair funding review, the census, the additional cost of national insurance, all bear on the non-ring fenced, non-adult social care part of each council's budget. And I just don't see how any changes, including even the census change, can be introduced without it leading to effectively just taking money from one set of councils to give it to another. That's all it does, because you're just dealing with an ever shrinking total for everything other than adult social care. And that means that it can only mathematically work like this. And I think that makes, as you've said, a fair funding review virtually impossible. I mean, the only thing I can see as a possible way out, and there was a hint in an article by Tom Newton-Dunn in the London Evening Standard last night about they're looking at reforms to council tax, I read, which you can all look at online, even not in London. And I can guess that at some point, some surcharge on higher bands of council tax in some places might be imaginable. Now, even that doesn't, by the way, link to income, just links to where relative house prices were in 1991. But you can just about see a redistribution because of a fair funding review where councils are allowed to put up council tax to compensate for the loss as a way forward. But even that would be pretty complicated. So I totally agree with the analysis, and I think that the new Secretary of State, the good thing about new Secretary of State is he's somebody who I think will be interested in all of this, and will be able to understand it. Therefore, it will be possible to have a discussion with him about all these details.
Yeah, and I think as well, Tony, he's the kind of Secretary of State that can stand up to the Treasury.
Yeah, I agree with that.
As an equal and push these sorts of things through. So I hadn't spotted the Tom Newton Dunn article, but I'll look at that because I know Westminster in the recent past have proposed having additional bans to raise more revenue. I'm not sure, and I know that the Treasury, with their view, was there's not a chance we're not touching council tax at all, but forget about it. So if they're now thinking that way, that is an interesting development, to be honest. It is interesting.
And what it doesn't do as well is address the regressive council tax nature in terms of the funding for authorities. So Knowsley, that doesn't have many band H's, isn't going to have many super band H's or band I's or whatever it is. So it would still, whether they do that and then allow the funding to move from those high tax base authorities to the low tax base. So assume that Westminster, Surrey et al. can deliver more via that, so they need even less grant. That would be the only way to do it. But council tax now is 2/3 of our funding, and it's been allowed to unmerge for 9 years with no equalisation, really. So they've created an even bigger problem, and another 3 years of no equalisation will just make Wokingham, etc. will have 5% increases. That means they'll be more disparate from Knowsley and Liverpool 3 years on. So interesting.
Just to read what I'll put this in the chat. What he wrote was, and it's the kind of thing, and I mean this as a compliment to him because he's a good journalist, wouldn't write if they hadn't been briefed it. Said, impatient red wall MPs are agitating the Prime Minister to unveil a symbolic new policy to give levelling up real-life definition for their voters. An eye-catching reform of business rates or of council tax that makes them better off is being mooted. That's what the article said.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll put that in the chat so people can enjoy it in their own time.
Thanks, Tony. And I guess the implication there is that councils would get additional ban, or would have to charge additional bans, I, J, K, whatever they might be, but then that would be equalised, so it was transferred over to the authorities that had lower tax bases.
And of course, as we all know, everybody in this conversation will know that it is very hard to explain to people how, if there were a revaluation of or any change to council tax, if you follow the normal logic and rules, no individual authority is better or worse off. So if you just follow normal equalisation rules in the past, it doesn't make any difference to any council's spending power. But it's very hard to have that argument with many people who don't spend their lives, as everybody on this call does, buried in the issue, because they imagine that all the money will go to Westminster.
Yes. Yeah. But
Which it could in another world, of course. It could, if there were a fair funding review that left Westminster worst off, and then Westminster allowed to put up its council tax to fund the loss. That is a way of delivering a fair funding review, but that's a long way from equalisation.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
We've got Rizvi, who's got
your hand up, background.
Hi. I was just going to say, just more generally about the fair funding review. The last consultation we had was 3 years ago, and we've never seen a response. So there have been formulas, and I think the LGA working group commented on certain things. I think the last time I saw it was June 2019. So it just feels really risky that suddenly, for 2-3 years, things have been very quiet. We don't know for certain if parking is out of the relative resource calculation. So, and it's the same point with New Homes Bonus, that we submitted consultation responses in April, and there's no kind of there's no sort of response to those collective views. So to implement anything, it's almost just lip service that we've consulted, but we're going to do something anyway without actually looking at how it affects both individual authorities or regions. And with New Homes Bonus, the reliance of districts on that grant, and even just a London borough, averages maybe 10 million pounds. Any risk, any change to that funding is a significant risk. So I like that they have delayed these these major changes for another year at least, potentially with at least fair funding. But I think we need answers on what's the time frame to release your responses from government to show us what you're proposing, and will we have a chance as a sector to look at those responses and comment on them, or is it a done deal that this is what it's going to be, and here you go, and you'll maybe have a multi-year settlement off the back of it? I think there's just too much. I think the sector needs to be more vocal in saying we want to see what you're proposing.
Yeah, I do agree with you, and even to say we're not going to do something next year because we're not ready, just tell us early rather than letting us wait right until, I don't know, December, a few months before. They do need to communicate that better. But I think the problem is, as much as anything, I don't think they know where it is they are going as much as anything. The one thing I would say though is that they're petrified of not consulting properly. So if they're going to do anything of any note in 22-23, to have not had a consultation paper the summer before, I think gets them quite nervous. To have not told you anything until the settlement itself, I think it'll be setting I don't know what you think, Stephen Fitzgerald. That's the kind of thing that gives civil servants nightmares, I'd imagine. Not consulting properly and just dropping proposals on people at the last minute. They don't tend to do that, do they? They tend to consult properly. Yeah. I think there's a few other questions in the chat, weren't there, Dan? There was one about census numbers, population numbers. Yeah, Tony, you had that comment about the census. And I thought someone else did as well. I think that that's going to be a timing issue. I think I don't know when the census figures will be available.
But they're normally about 18 months to 2 years after the headline figures. The population. I mean, there's a really interesting issue. The headline data normally 18 months or so after. That's the top line, council by council population figures. But all the detailed stuff, and there was a glancing reference earlier from Dan, I think, to catching up, proper equalisation. But all the detailed numbers, which used to underpin all the detailed calculations of spending need, were based on data that will gradually become available after that, by 2024, I'm guessing. Then there's the question of, whether the whole of the underpinning level of equalisation, which feeds through into tariffs and top-ups, assuming they still exist, are then updated.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think census is off. Yesterday on the coronavirus data website, they said they were going to update population for mid-2020 estimates, which would indicate that census at middle super output area is still a way off.
Yeah. Jeff, you got your hand up again.
Yeah, sorry, Adrian, I like to talk.
Yeah.
Just picking up on a colleague asking about the council issue there, and again, you'll have picked up in the call with Alex Skinner last week. I think there is a very clear expectation that we will be given flexibility on council tax. And we're working on the basis that it'll be exactly the same as the one we had previously, 6% over 3 years, right, with next to increase it in a variable fashion after how you referenced. A lot of the county councils, because of their elections, didn't go for the full 3% this year. So right, by having a 6% variation over 3 years, it'll give us all the chance to, go 222, 321. In the county council case, nothing 33. So pretty sure I think that's what will happen on the council tax. And on the social care funding, as you've identified, we're working on the assumption of 1.6 billion extra every year for social care. Yeah. And the two key things that's going to be needed for in terms of extra impact, again, as you've referenced, one is the self-funder issue, which will be massive, and the second being the care cap. But I think we all recognise that both of those issues impact much more on affluent areas than you do in deprived areas. So I think that RNS that we showed with that massive plex seems to me something that the government may well adopt for apportioning out that new funding.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that funding, when it comes, will not be ring fenced, so we'll be able to use it as we wish. The thing we all know is that all that money, if it's for those two key issues, self-funders and charging, the charging one won't land until October 23.
Mm-hmm.
But that one doesn't start to impact until a year and a half's time. So I'm pretty sure that the government will give us the full 1.6 billion. I'll be stunned if they don't use that new RMF to distribute some or all, and they'll advise us, actually, you don't need all this money in 22-23, because the changes on charging don't come till 23-24, but we'll give you the money and that will help you with COVID.
Right.
I can see that being a logical, illogical way forward.
I think on the council tax issue, if it's another, I do some council tax modelling, and the difference, I often use Knowsley and Wokingham, who happen to have pretty much the same number of properties, and their bandees within a few pence of each other. Yet Wokingham gets twice the council tax income from that same number of properties at the same bandee because of the E to H's and the A to D's that are more prevalent to Knowsley. So all that doing the social care precept will do is again allow those authorities with high tax bases, rich tax bases, to be okay, and would again, I'd say, call for whatever funding comes in to have some degree of equalisation. I know the social care grant does, because it removes the council tax impact, but the longer they let council tax go up and up, the higher we are geared towards council tax, the bigger will be the problem when they have to come to try and make it fairer at some point in the future.
Dan, we've got tax base, so fully understand that, and we rely upon equalisation, and I'm sure equalisation will occur because of the red wall MP. So yeah. Pretty sure that will happen, and it'll either be, in reality, the new grant is very much bent towards more affluent areas, and probably quite rightly so because of the impact of self-funders and charging. Then there's plenty of scope for equalisation in the grant.
Yeah, but it needs to be undamped equalisation as well, doesn't it? Because my fear is there's so many changes that you put equalisation in, you create a massive redistribution. You have to damp it all away because nobody likes big shocks for any one authority. But effectively, damping will leave all of the unequalised gains into those that have the lowest needs, one might argue.
And it happens because some of us will say we haven't got enough.
Yeah, but it does feel though that a lot of the action is going to be around council tax, whether it's about raising more of it to fund services, whether it's about putting new bans on to equalise and to distribute to red wall areas, levelling up, or whether it is around equalisation generally, and that's not happening. But it feels, my worry is that the government use it as a way of generating resource and redistributing quickly without really getting to the fundamental problem, which is that, A, it's really unevenly distributed, and B, it's a huge amount of our funding now and it's not been equalised for what, 8 years or so. So that's the worry.
You mentioned spending power there. I can't wait for the spending power stuff to come out, showing that all those council tax increases fully being exercised. Yeah, I can imagine it's going to be huge, but at least it gives us that freedom. And I think Tony made the point there that a lot of the delay in increasing the tax this year was because of elections. There were more elections next May, but I suppose that being able to spread 6% over 3 years does mean that you can manage it around your election cycle to some degree. Which I think is probably a handy thing. Yeah. Nick Morgan from North Yorkshire just making the point there that especially after the national insurance increases, there's going to be more reluctance about having large council tax increases. Certainly locally, it doesn't sound like nationally they're that bothered. It sounds like nationally that's their chosen way of raising revenue, and they seem to be happy with that. I'm still off mute. The National Insurance for Social Care, we picked up an information that some of the funding, the 1.6, is to provide us funding with an increased care fees. Linked to the care over 5%. We would ask the question, what about all the other things that we have?
You mean to use the funding that you're going to get from within the 5.4 billion to help providers?
Yeah.
I can see that. I can see that where a lot of the worry is going to be, that there's only so much pressure you can put on providers, especially when rates are going to be shifting around.
Well, you all know, and therefore, I think it's 5%.
Say again, Jeff.
We're achieving an increase in national living wage of 5%, particularly so the government can deflect the 1.25% national insurance increase on the low pay. Wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if that 5% is higher, just looking at the low pay commission reports, but I can't see anything less than 5%, which, as we all know, has a massive impact on the care charges.
Yeah, let's hope someone's feeding that into the spending review for the end of the month. I noticed Stephanie pointed out that my error in saying that the September CPI figure is available. It's actually the August CPI figure that was released this month. We've got to wait another month for the September CPI that will be used in the multiplier. I think what's clear is it's definitely going up, and I think it's certainly going to be more than 2%. So I think what we're looking at is, I'm fairly sure they'll cap it to something around 2%. Can't see them allowing a 3 or even higher percent increase in inflation to flow through into business rate increases. So apologies though for my jumping the gun on the multiplier increase.
Adrian, Lindsay's asked about the assumptions in your model in respect of the replacement new homes bonus.
Yeah, I mean, in the model at the moment, we've just assumed that there's no additional 1 year. We just assumed that you get the final single year payment that you were due, and that was announced in the that was kind of implied in the last settlement. I suppose we could push it and say that there'll be one further one-off year again in 22-23. I just don't know, and my guess is that with the spending review happening, almost imminently, that a replacement to NHB will be, is almost upon us really. And if that's the case, I'm guessing they'll want to just have that in place for 22-23. No idea what it'll be like though. I've no idea at all. The consultation paper just gave no clues as to which way they're going. Any option was possible.
It did feel like a replacement rather than a scrapping of, didn't it though? Because I know lots of places have just assumed that after next year it just disappears completely, which I know because of lower tier services grant, that would be catastrophic for some types of authority all at once. So it feels like maybe they'll drop the control total, but there will be some replacement, which is better than it being scrapped entirely, I guess. Yeah,
and I guess I wonder if things change a little bit with them. Michael Gove now being Secretary of State. Housing's been a really important part of his portfolio now.
Yeah.
Brief.
And I was on
something in place, I'd imagine, for April next year.
I was on a DCN thing when we were speaking to officials, and they said we would definitely know before settlement date what the response to the NHB consultation was. And I think you're right, Adrian. Probably will be spending review that maybe it will, because it's kind of no good to us at settlement date. It's all done and dusted, isn't it?
No, not at all. Yeah. Let's see if they can deliver on that. Dan, I think it's the have we got any other questions that we've not covered?
Got most of them. Anyone feel free to unmute and shout if you've got any burning.
Tony here again. I don't want to say too much. I've just put some stuff in the chat about inflation. I think that there's an incentive for the Treasury to want a multi-year settlement for local government, because they can assume inflation is 2% a year over 3 years in that settlement. And that then for them is a sort of hedging position, which a local government would like a 3-year settlement. And, you know, the consensus of forecasters is inflation will go up then down. So you can see in terms of a hedging position for the Treasury, a 3-year local government settlement makes sense, providing they can get inflation low in it.
Yeah.
Or inflation assumptions low in it.
You can imagine as well, can't you, Tony, that the inflation assumption within the spending review long term over the 3 years is going to be 2% GDP deflated. That's what we're going to use. So that's the guideline for whether you've got real terms growth or you're just matching inflation. Yeah.
There's a sort of new logic to this because we haven't really had this kind of expectation of inflation for decades in quite this way. And it creates a whole new set of dynamism and logic. And for the Treasury, it definitely means locking people in over longer periods with low settlements. Yeah,
and then claiming their real terms growth, or you match your real terms flat. Yeah. Jane, you made a point about social care grants that they've been one-off in nature, but have been paid for a few years now. I mean, I must say my assumption has been for a few years now that if you're getting social care grants, that's the new baseline for next year, and that they won't go anywhere. They'll just be added to. So I really would work on that basis for 22-23 onwards. That whatever you're getting now, there may be redistribution to some degree, but the quantum nationally won't go down. I really don't think. And then probably finally, Holly. So
yeah, Stephen's got his hand up, and you've got Holly's question there about pooling.
Yeah, Holly, I know quite a few people who are looking at pooling in 22-23, and I guess you could say that if they were seriously thinking about resetting the baseline in 22-23, would they be thinking about extending pooling into that year as well? I mean, there'll be no point. The fact that they are still pushing it suggests they're not going to reset. But I know quite a few people, Holly, who are definitely considering it, and even some that didn't do it this year are thinking about reviving it for next year as well. So, Stephen, do you want to?
Yeah, very briefly. For some reason, the chat functionality seems to have disappeared from my screen, so I put it in rather than what I might have done in chat. I mean, just your point, Adrian, on the, if you like, the surprise factor. I mean, obviously, officials like to do things properly and consult and all those things. I think sometimes, though, we forget, though, we're in a rather different ball game with this government. So, and with Gove coming in and, his probable brief to do something, there could be kind of quite, I think, unexpected events. The other more fundamental problem, the slide that really came home to me, was your slide on health spending.
Yeah.
And the fundamental problem seems to me that we have is that while health spending increases, as far as I can see, without anything like the financial control we would expect to exercise in local government, both local government, central government, and just about everybody else has a fundamental problem, because the beast continues to need to be fed, and there's really no scope for fundamental rebasing of our expenditure while that goes on. And I mean, I was shouted down by an official some years ago when I suggested, well, there is a difference between the local government regime with the CFO responsibility, having a legal responsibility, and the health service regime, where frankly it doesn't really matter too much if you're overspent, because eventually a bailout will come. But until that fundamental issue is addressed, there is a problem. And at the moment, there isn't much political capital to be gained from addressing it, because people are rightly emotionally attached to the way the health service is at the moment, not the way it might be if it became financially sustainable.
Yeah. Actually, what I thought was odd, Steve, was that the way that they they're pretending that that levy is going to go to social care in 25, 26. As you said, Tony, everyone knows it's going to go to the health service. The health service knows it. Ministers know it. Everyone knows it. Yet ministers had to try and pretend that it wasn't going to go there. I don't quite know what the, what's made them do that. Whether are they embarrassed that they've caved so fundamentally to the NHS, that are they embarrassed that it's just continues to consume so much, and as you said, Steve, the beast has to be fed. It's really worrying, though, isn't it? And it's really worrying. Where does it stop? Where does that percentage of public spending go into the NHS? What's the upper limit? Is it 50%, 60%? You can see it hitting there, can't you? Really? Yeah. But I think at least with Gove, we're going to have things are going to happen, aren't they? We're not going to get quite so much drift. It's going to be more, reforms pushed through, things changing, which I guess must be. Is it a good thing? I think it's a good thing. I think it is.
Might be good, might be bad. Probably more certain than uncertain. Whether it's good or bad yet to be seen.
That's true. That's true. That's great. I think we've got to 11:30. We'll call it a day there. Thank you all for contributing. Thank you for joining the call as well. Hopefully it's been useful, and we'll definitely try and we will certainly be doing these very regularly in the next 3 or 4 months as stuff starts to move a lot more quickly. So thanks, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.